evening to everyone. My name is Elaine Chu, and I'm a professor here at the law school, but I'm also the director of the Ronald H. Brown Center for Civil Rights and Economic Development. And I want to welcome all of you to tonight's event, An Evening with Quentin Williams. The conversation continues. In addition to the center, this event was made possible through the support and efforts of numerous people and organizations, and I just want to briefly list them here. First, we have Dean Michael Simons. Second, we have some student organizations such as the American Constitution Society. We also had the support of the Dedication to Community Tour, which is an international forum that our keynote founded to promote the exchange of ideas. And then last, but definitely not least, we have a new group at the law school that did the heavy lifting in putting together this event, and that's the Coalition for Social Justice. And so before I continue, I wanted to invite two people who are currently leading this coalition to just come up and say a couple of words to you about this new effort of theirs. Leah and Ian.
Our president, Maurice Saye, was not able to make it because he's in Washington meeting Clarence Thomas. So that's a great excuse not to be here, I suppose. Again, thank you for coming. This event is really important to us, primarily because it's going to start encouraging people to really begin to think in the shoes of others and begin to objectively think about the experiences of others. And we're not so much as trying to get people to change the way they think, but at least try to put themselves in other shoes to really get a better perspective on the experiences of others. And I'm going to have Ian speak about our mission statement.
Thank you, Leah. Welcome, everyone. Glad to see so many tall. Let me put this bad boy up here. I'm going to pull up the mission statement just so we can see what this is about. Firstly, I'd like to thank Mr. Williams, faculty, Jean, Professor Barrett, Dean Simons, for being a part of this. The Coalition for Social Justice. Our mission statement was a collaborative effect, or a collaborative endeavor from many of the students and faculty trying to reach a singular goal, a goal that we hope can reach everyone involved. And it thus reads, the Coalition for Social Justice is an alliance of law students, faculty members, and community leaders. Our goal is simple: to continue the conversation and serve the community, to address social injustice in all its forms, and to brainstorm practical solutions to effectuate its eradication, to create an open, positive space for discourse and disagreement, to clear the fog of apathy, and to continue to form a more perfect community. We believe that the catalyst for change lies in agitation of ideas, and our goal is to shape things up. With those words, we hope that a singular idea will come forth from the conversation we have here today. We can exchange ideas and take something back into our own communities, into our own lives, into our own businesses and streets, and hopefully the things that we see in the media, the perceptions we have of each other, of others, of ourselves, will continue to evolve into a more positive way. Nothing to say. So I'm done talking. I don't know. Next, Professor Chu.
Thank you. So if anyone out there wants to work with this group, and I'm so happy that many of them are first years because they will be with us for a while. But even faculty members or staff, please introduce yourself to Leah and Ian, and they'll be sure to include you in their future initiatives. So all of us came together to work on tonight's event because we wanted to continue that momentum and that buzz that began in this building on January 20th. That night we had very honest and inclusive school-wide discussions about race and the criminal justice system, about the passing of Eric Gardner and Michael Brown, about the subsequent failures to indict their killers, and about the continuing crisis between communities and police officers and departments throughout this country. Now, since that first night of our spring semester, much has continued to evolve, much has continued to happen. So, of course, there have been additional shootings and killings and injuries to unarmed civilians by police officers. But in addition, in February, we had the leading federal investigator in this country, the director of the FBI, give very searing and honest statements at Georgetown University about the national problem of racial bias in our country that most certainly includes the police, but also extends way beyond the police. In early March, we had the announced decision by the Justice Department not to bring federal civil rights charges against Officer Darren Wilson. Also in early March, we had the release of a report by the same Justice Department that concluded that the police in Ferguson had been routinely violating the civil rights of its black residents. And then most recently, there have been several top city officials in Ferguson who have resigned, including the police chief, in the wake of that report. So tonight at St. John's Law School, we're also continuing to evolve our conversation, and we're proud to have lead us tonight one of our own, Quentin Williams. Far from retirement, Quentin has already had one of those exciting careers that probably 99% of us envy. He grew up in Yonkers, New York, and he attended Boston College on a full football scholarship. In 1991, he graduated from our law school with a concentration in labor law. He worked for a year at a law firm, and then he was appointed to be a special agent for the FBI. Doing that for several years, he then became an assistant U.S. attorney and prosecuted white-collar and blue-collar criminal cases. From there, Quentin Williams moved into the world of professional sports. And as an attorney and as an executive, he worked for the NFL, the Jacksonville Jaguars, and then the NBA. Today, he's the chairperson and CEO of the Butler Lappert Williams firm, a full-service law firm here in New York City that has clients from the worlds of business, sports and entertainment, technology, media, fashion, and many, many other industries. As I mentioned earlier, he has also done a lot of work in the world of nonprofits. Most notably, he's founded a nonprofit organization known as the Dedication to Community Tour. And if all of this has not kept him busy enough, Quentin Williams recently published a book called A Survival Guide: How Not to Get Killed by the Police, Part 1, and has been doing a wide circuit of local and national TV and radio and social media appearances recently, talking about his perspectives. So tonight, he comes home to share with us his thoughts and his perspectives. Please join me in welcoming Quentin Williams.
Thank you very much. It's always nice to come back. And today I have some friends in the house. I have some of my classmates. I even have the offspring of some of my classmates in the back. So this is really special for me. I get to see my old professors who are not old, ex-professors, former professors, and to see the new faces here, the new faces of the future leaders. And I speak to you primarily, the future leaders. When I was 6 years old, I had the distinct privilege and pleasure to live in two different worlds. As Wayne said, I lived in Yonkers, New York. That was what I did Monday through Friday. I went to public school, lived in a low to poor, I'd say, economic range of people who were my neighbors. I was in poverty. I was on welfare until I was 17 years old. So that's where I lived primarily. But then, on the weekends, I got to spend time with my grandparents. My maternal grandparents lived in a much nicer area of Westchester County. And dogwood trees, dead-end roads, no fire trucks, no police lights. And I'd spend my weekends there with them. And we came a long way from the time I was born until my 6th birthday, because I wasn't always allowed to spend time with them. For the first 5 years of my life, my grandparents, primarily my maternal grandmother, didn't want me to come to her house. She was embarrassed. My mother's a white Jewish woman who married a black Christian man and had a black kid during the height of the civil rights movement. So my maternal grandmother was not necessarily fond of this whole idea. Biracial wasn't the word that was used then. So I would spend my time with my grandparents on weekends. And by the time I turned 6, they loved me. They were incredible people. They were the best grandparents I could ever dream of having. And one summer day, I remember it fairly vividly. One summer day, it had to be a blistering 90 degrees out. And I asked my grandmother if I could put my swimsuit on and if I could have a towel, because the kids across the street were playing in the pool of one of our neighbors. Now, this town, just so I can set the stage here, this town was completely monolithic. I was the only black kid in town, and I didn't even live there, but my grandparents. So my grandmother said, yeah, sure, here's your swimsuit, put it on, this is gonna be great, here's a towel. And I walked over to my neighbor, and my neighbors, by the way, all had kids. By this time, we were all friends. Ride bikes with them, go to the ice cream truck with them. And I walked over to this one neighbor's house where the pool was, and all the kids were playing. You could hear the splashing. Everybody was having so much fun. And when I approached the pool, the neighbor said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "Oh, I'm just going to go swimming with my friends." And the neighbor said to me, "But you can't swim in this pool. You'll make it dirty." And so at 6 years old, I was given a rude awakening that there was something extraordinarily different between me and them. And so I went back to my grandmother's house, and another neighbor stopped me. A neighbor whose kids were actually in the pool. And she said, "Mike," my first name is Michael, and some of my old friends still call me Mike. Some call me Mike Q, some call me Money Mike. So I told the neighbor that the reason why I wasn't swimming was because they said that I'd make the water dirty, so I'm just going to go back to my grandmother's house. And she was outraged. completely outraged. She told the story years later to my mother. By that time, I had forgotten about this. Fast forward 20 years. I'm a student, or maybe 18 years. I'm a student here at St. John's. And I'm studying. I think I was in my second year. And I'm studying in that house. And the reason why I'm studying in that house is because my grandparents passed away and they left the house to my mother. So now, I live in this town, and I live on that street. And the neighbors are still the same neighbors. And we all have accepted each other. We're all friends. I play cards with the neighbors' sons. And one day, I'm studying away, as we used to do. Beautiful summer day. I was a Feb, so I went through the summers. For those of you who don't know what Febs are, we used to do summer courses and do it in 2.5 years. Studying away on a 90-degree day one summer. And out of the blue, I hear a screeching yell. Screeching yell that tore through me. It was so loud. Yelling my first name, Michael. 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 Michael, help me. Please help me. So I run downstairs, out of my bedroom. I run outside, and I see the neighbor. The neighbor who at one point said I was going to turn her pool water dirty. On her knees, crying for me to help her. Her husband had cancer. He had bone cancer. Started in the lungs, went to the bone. It was an awful thing. He was showering, and his leg just broke, snapped. And he was in the shower by himself. He was too heavy for her to lift. She knew I was home because she saw my car parked in front. So she yelled out my name and asked for my help. And of course I helped her. I went up to her husband and picked him up. We called the ambulance, which was brought to the hospital. He died a few months later. My mother told me the story about the dirty pool water after this happened. I didn't know about this at the time. She told me about it when I was in my 30s. And it made me reflect on my childhood with those neighbors. And so I questioned myself, would I have done anything different on that day when she called for my help because of what she did when I was 6 years old? And I said, unwavering, extraordinarily support. I said, absolutely not. I would not have done anything different. I would have run to her aid the same way I did, as if I didn't know it. And then I started to reflect more on what this all means. When somebody judges another based on whatever it is, and how at some point we may be calling on each other for help. I was her enemy as a 6-year-old. I didn't know it, but I was. And I was her ally as a 24-year-old. And so what I bring this story up to you for the obvious reason because we as a nation have such great potential. The reason why I think we have this potential is because of the different hues, different outlooks, different perspectives, different cultures. I look into this audience, and I can see all of that. And those different perspectives bring us to a place where we're superior if we're working together. But if we're not, if we're telling people that they're different and different isn't good, we end up at some point having a light shone on that flawed outlook. Just like my neighbor had a light shone on her flawed outlook when she needed help. So I wrote this book. I wrote this book because 3 years ago, my wife and I were starting to think about having kids, and don't laugh, I'm going to be 50, and I was starting to think about having kids at 46. Well, some people in this room never thought I'd even get married, so better late. But we started to think about having kids, and I was concerned that my children would not understand that there is a certain way of dealing, certain way of interacting with the police that will heighten the odds of you making it home safely. And my wife, because she's brilliant, is the one who thought of this idea. Because she saw over the course of our 15 years together how many times I was being stopped by the police, either approached or stopped in a car. And it frustrated her because she was there to see it all happen. There was no reason, 98% of the time, there was no reason for me to be approached. And so she said, I just can't understand why this is happening. And that's what she would say every time a police officer pulls over and approach. And my response to her was, please, let me handle it. And when we were done, she would say to me, this is just too much. And on top of that, there are people out there who don't know how to do what you just did. Well, what I just did was I basically built a relationship with the police during that stop. I used it as an opportunity for them to get to know who I was and for me to get to know who they are, and then to shake their hand and thank them for their service. And by the end of it, they were smiling. And so my wife said to me, you need to write a book about this. There are people who don't know how to do that. And number two, there are people who are actually losing their freedom and maybe their lives because they don't know how to do it. So I wrote this book, but I wrote it for my kids because I was concerned about how they would one day interact with the police. And I shelved it. Much to her dismay, I shelved it. And then, with everything that's been happening in society, it was my duty and our responsibility to at least give this to the public so that people will have a tool, one tool in their toolbox to use if they're ever approached by police. The reason for the book is simple: to get people to make it home safely. The book isn't about race on its surface, but of course, it's a jump-off point for the discussion. It's a very simple tool to handle an extremely complicated issue. And making it home safely is the one thing that I want people to do, because if you don't, it's irreversible. So that's the reason for the book, and that's what the book is about. I'd like just to go back to race for 1 second. Whenever anybody asks me, I get this all the time, that, we are post-racial and we're moving beyond people seeing race. I like to just propose that we take a little experiment, and maybe you can do this yourself when you have a chance. It will take you 2 minutes. Take any Fortune 500 company, because this isn't just a law enforcement issue that we're talking about. Take any Fortune 500 company, Google it, go to the headquarters page, the leadership page, and look at the faces. And when you look at those faces, then do 1 or 2 more things. First of all, remove the director of diversity from that. Because obvious selfish reasons. But on top of that, check out who has budgetary power, who controls money. And if you do that, a very vivid picture will be painted for you. A lot of this is about economics, and we need to understand the way economics comes into play. And when you participate in that little experiment with me, I think you'll, with clarity, understand that we have a long way to go. But with the faces I see today, especially the young ones, the dialogue that you're creating, the action you're taking, the strategy that you're forming, we have a shot to do something in my lifetime. And that's all I want to see. I want to see something done in my lifetime. I thank you. I don't want to take up too much of your time. I'd rather sit down here with these good people and answer some questions. But I thank you for participating. This is important. And may God bless you.
Thanks. That was a really excellent start, I think, to our conversation tonight. What we've designed in a format is really something quite informal and we hope engaging, interactive with you and the audience. And so what I want to introduce you to is the time that we're going to now have, which is what we call the round table. But it's basically a conversation that we're going to have with some folks in the front, but we definitely, all of us agree, we want to be speaking with you in the audience too. Just to give you a sense, I mean, you probably recognize many of the faces here, but I just want to say the thought was we would gather some of us in the building who have some experience in law enforcement, like Quentin Williams does, and that with that in our background as a part of our life experiences, we perhaps would be able to offer some of those perspectives to the rest of you who may share that or may not share that. So in particular, I just wanted to highlight Jean Dirks, who is a first-year student and also a member of this great coalition for social justice. In case you know it or not, Jean is, prior to coming to law school, also experienced in law enforcement, having had a career with the NYPD and also serving us as a veteran with the U.S. Army. So I get the privilege of asking the first question. I was kind of reviewing, as I mentioned earlier, the speech from the FBI Director, James Comey. Quentin was always good to forward links to the FBI Director's public statements to me over the past 2 months. And at Georgetown, one of the things we talked about were the 4 truths. And the third truth that he shared with his audience there was that everyone who, well, let me start with the second truth, that a lot of people who come into law enforcement are folks who have a very genuine desire to do good, to achieve justice. Many of you out there, our students, have that same desire. And he said that the third truth was that, though, experiencing law enforcement, doing the jobs they have, whether they're police officers, prosecutors, correction officers, day in and day out, there is an effect, there's a consequence to having that life experience. And for many, he said, as a sad third truth, it becomes what he calls cynicism. And I'm just curious whether Quentin and the rest of you share the director's sense of that, or if you think that that was a bit too narrow, a description of the experience of having been in law enforcement.
I'm going to start with a quick story to speak to Professor Truthful, not cynicism. I was a police officer in the 9-0 precinct of Brooklyn for almost 8 years. I also spent a lot of time with the military. And it's true, a lot of cops do join up thinking they're going to go out, do good works, save the world, help people, all the good stuff you might see in the movies or that you dream about when you're looking for that sort of career. But I can remember one time in particular that might speak to this point on being cynical. At one point I was at the precinct and I was thinking, what can I do today to affect positive change in Williamsburg, which is where I was. What does the community really need? So I went to a friend of mine and I said, Officer so-and-so, what's the single biggest threat to the 9-0 precinct that's the biggest threat right now? And he took me by the arm and he led me down the hall and he brought me to the CO's office and he pointed at the door. And that's what he was talking about. It was the CO, the commanding officer, excuse me. And that was his belief that the very man that we were serving as under his command was the biggest threat in the precinct. And I never forgot that. And I don't know, I'm not going to tell you if it's true or not, but that's what he thought. And unfortunately, I'm sure he wasn't the only one. So if there's cynicism, absolutely. That's all.
Believe it or not, in the FBI, there's a lot of cynicism. And, when you think about law enforcement, sometimes you think about maybe the FBI is above the fray when it comes to that stuff. But it's not necessarily the truth, because those veteran agents who've seen a lot and are pretty much on the way out, some of them feel that way. I happen to work with some great people, and many of them didn't feel that way, but one quick story. We had a guy I was in the Bridgeport resident agency when I was in the FBI. I was transferred down from New Haven after my first year, and I went undercover immediately. And we had one guy in there who was, maybe he had 2 years left on the job. And every day he would come into the office cussing and upset and unhappy. And I said to myself, I'm a young agent and very impressionable. I said to my partner, I said, well, what's up with him? And he was like, oh, don't worry about him. He's Happy Jack. Happy Jack. And so, from that point on, I called Jack Happy Jack, with sarcasm, of course. And every time I do it, it would make him laugh a little bit. But there was always something wrong. There was never anything good. And those kinds of people exist in every industry. The issue with existing like that as a law enforcement officer is that because you have authority to take a life and the authority to take away freedom, it plays on the lives of others like no other industry. So, yes, there's cynicism. Yes, there are people like that. The issue is that cynicism always leaks into the way they perform, and leaks into the way they judge, and leaks into the way they conduct themselves. And so for you, young people in the audience who may go into law enforcement, I ask you to guard against that, because the older law enforcement agents, they will push that idea on you. Some of them will push that idea on you at times, like Happy Jack was pushing it on me. Every day I would see him mad, and there is a little bit of an inclination to say, yeah, man, that's right. Yeah, your daughter's 16 and she shouldn't be out dating, which is what he was upset about a lot of times. But don't let it happen. Don't let it happen. You have too much of a privilege to hold.
So, I'll add a little bit of perspective and then another question. I can remember when I was a federal prosecutor, working in the U.S. Attorney's Office, having to consciously remind myself, it wasn't so much cynicism, but I can remember being in arraignment court late in the afternoon, early in the evening, dealing with what to me was another run-of-the-mill drug case. And we were sort of processing it in a bureaucratic way. And I had to remind myself that this is not a big deal for me. This is a big deal for the guy who just got arrested and for his family that's sitting in front of him. And when you have a role to play in the system, it's very easy, whether cynicism or not, to become bureaucratic. Nothing was going to happen at the arraignment other than the judge was going to make sure the defendant had been informed of the charges. We were going to tell the judge when he was arrested. The judge was going to remand the defendant. We'd schedule a hearing. So it wasn't something that required compassion. It wasn't something that required insight. It wasn't something that required a good heart. But the danger of a system like that is it becomes just a system, just a bureaucracy. But there's a challenge too to the people who are in that system, whether they're prosecutors or more direct law enforcement officers. And that is the reality of what you're dealing with. This is part of what Director Comey was talking about. When you're a police officer, part of your job is to serve the community, stand there and be helpful and get cats out of trees and give people directions. But a major part of your job is finding and arresting criminals, rapists, muggers, murderers, people who abuse their spouses, and in a way that people outside law enforcement might not understand. I would include myself in that. I was a prosecutor. I was sitting in a fancy office wearing a suit. Think about the percentage of your human interactions that are with criminals. And then think about, I'm not talking about guilty or not, I'm talking about people who are actively committing crimes against other people. And then think about what police officers do on a daily basis. And it's not a criticism of the police officers to say that creates a real structural challenge in ensuring that they can deal with each individual they encounter as a unique human being worthy of respect. And then add to that the racial imbalance in the interactions that police officers have. I think about my experience as a prosecutor. If I was supervising agents, FBI agents who were doing surveillance of a crack cocaine dealing operation in Central Brooklyn, and a white guy showed up, that would get everyone's attention because something unusual is going on. And race becomes a lens, a factual lens, through which to see the world that on some levels is completely rational when you're trying to figure out what's happening. But then creates immense challenges when you see the way that can affect other interactions that police have, where race is distorting what they're doing and creating additional challenges. So, what do we do?
Okay, so it's cultural. Okay, we're not talking about technicalities. We're in a law school where that's what we talk about every day. Technically, what happens? Why was the officer who put a chokehold on Garner not indicted? Those are very important issues, and legislatively we need to handle some things in some states, namely maybe Florida. But the deeper issue here is what's cultural here. Why are we talking about black people, Latinos? Why are we talking about them being treated differently? When I was an FBI agent, I put in the book, on vacation, I got arrested in Newport, Rhode Island for walking down the street. And when I tell this story to people, they look kind of dumbfounded. Why were you arrested? I said, because they thought I was a guy who put a gun to somebody earlier. And I was black, and that guy was black. So they arrested me. And when I told them that I was an FBI agent, they didn't believe me. They absolutely didn't believe me. And when I showed them when they took my badge and creds from me and looked at it and turned it upside down several times, they didn't believe they were the real thing. They thought that I just had an FBI badge on me, walking down Main Street of Newport, Rhode Island, with my 9mm gun. And so they didn't treat me like I was an FBI agent. They treated me like I was a criminal. And so I have to think about it from their perspective to just kind of reflect properly. And from their perspective, they get a call that a black guy puts a 9mm gun to a white kid at the Marriott in Newport, Rhode Island at 3:30 p.m. on a hot August day and says, "What you gonna do now, white boy?" And they get that call. Now, have any of you been to Newport, Rhode Island? Well, I was probably the only black kid up there on that. Well, if it actually happened, I'm still not convinced that it happened. But at the time, I may have been the only one up there walking down the street. So they see me and they call me over. And the way I saw this interaction was the cop over there, I waved to him across the street. "How you doing?" He waved at me, "Hey, how you doing?" I thought they knew I was an FBI agent. That's the way I was thinking. I'm going to a party to visit with other FBI agents. So I go across the street to say hello, as I always do with police officers. And as soon as I pulled up to him, I said, "How's it going, officer? Thank you for your service. What you up to tonight?" And he said, "Put your hands behind your back, get up against the cruiser." I had no idea that flashing lights were behind me. There were cruisers. There were about 12 other officers. So that I complied with what he said. And he put me into the cruiser, and that's where I stayed handcuffed for a pretty long time. But before I went into that cruiser, I told him, "I don't know what's going on here." I actually thought they were playing a joke on me. My friends were real jokesters, the FBI agents. So I said, "This is a really good one," because they got the police department involved in this one. I said, "I don't know what's going on, but just so you know, I'm an FBI agent." He was like, "All right, okay, right." I said, "What happened?" He said, "Shut up, get in the cruiser." And that's where I was. And they took my badge and my gun and they were looking at it. I can almost understand why they approached me. I can. Black guy in Newport with a gun to somebody. Black guy in Newport, he had a gun. They didn't know that. Okay. The problem I have with the situation is, once I was in the cruiser, they absolutely didn't believe that I was an FBI agent. And not that FBI agents haven't done anything bad in the past. But I was an FBI agent with a verifiable alibi. I was actually in Norwalk, Connecticut when this happened at 3:30 that day. And I insisted that they call my special agent in charge to speak to him, to ask him where I was. And they didn't want to do it. They were like, special agent in charge. You don't know. When I insisted over and over again, they finally took me seriously. I think there's an issue there because that whole force was made up of people who didn't look like me. There was nobody they could call to say, "Hey, see if you could talk to him and see what really happened if he was here." Culturally, these police officers didn't even know how to relate to me. So what they knew they had to do was keep me in handcuffs, and that's what they did. And that was the issue with that incident. Not that they approached me, but what happened after they approached me and handcuffed me, the way I was treated. So we do have a cultural issue here that we need to take care of. I think that's what we're all looking to speak to. We're not speaking to the technicalities of whether somebody's indicted or not. But tell you in just a few sentences here, all has to do with predisposition. It's the reason why the kids who were in that pool that I was talking about agreed with their mother that I would turn the water dirty. They're brought up in a culture that tells them that the water will turn dirty if a black kid goes into a pool with white kids. Those kids, this happens 1,000 times a year with that kind of interaction back in 1971. Those kids, they grow up to be law enforcement officers. They grow up to be CEOs. They grow up to be executives. They grow up to be people with power. It's very difficult to take that childhood and delete it from your mind. It has an impact, whether consciously or subconsciously. And that's what we need to get to. That's the issue. How do we overcome that cultural difference? And how do we get people to understand that these differences are good for us, not bad for us? Well, I think this is the first step, of course. And then in terms of law enforcement, the three-step process is the selection process, the education process, and the methodology for policing. Select the right people, educate them properly, and then the methods by which they police have to include community policing. We've gotten away from it. Cops sit in cars. Cops need to walk beats. They need to get to know people. They need to build relationships with people. And if they do that, I think we'll be a little bit more proactive in our efforts rather than reactive as law enforcement officers.
I have a question about political will and law enforcement reaction. In the last year, the first year of Mayor de Blasio's mayoralty, he obviously had bumpy relations with the police and has sort of recalibrated and navigated that, as opposed to pushing politically for the kinds of recruitment and training and accountability and discipline, et cetera, that I think are the paradigm you're talking about. I'm not picking on de Blasio or the NYPD or anything, but won't law enforcement of its current cast, which could be better, be a tremendously resistant entity if external social, political, legal forces try to move it to the place where we all want to get to get? And then what do we do about that impasse?
I'd like to hear what Gene has to say about this, because this is so important. I'm going to turn it right over to you, Gene. When we talk about the internal workings of police forces, we always talk about the blue shield. And the police officers these guys and gals are knocking down doors with each other, risking their lives with each other. There's a certain bond that happens when you do that. And so there is an innate feeling of and necessity to protect each other. And this blue shield is a result. The issue is that irrespective of what's happening, that blue shield is up. And I think the politicians and the people on the outside are going to have to find a way to penetrate it by telling the Blue Shield's leadership that really doesn't help them. Because 1 to 2% of cops are doing stuff that they shouldn't do. Why does the other 98% have to take the fall for it? Once that 98% understands that living with integrity means if somebody does something wrong, let's discipline them. Let's make sure they're disciplined properly and not scapegoated. And let's make sure that the integrity of our force is intact. Because once you're protecting somebody who did something wrong, it's a house of cards. The community will never believe anything, will never trust anything. It only takes one time. When we see police officers or former police officers going on television talking about how a certain case, everything was okay, whether it's Garner or whether it's Trayvon, I know that's not, Zimmerman wasn't a cop, but
What do you want?
yeah, he wanted to be one, he was acting under color of law. When the police or the brethren protects something that, although technically couldn't get indicted, convicted, but there was something wrong with that, just shout it out. Say, yeah, I mean, the guy shouldn't have been in a chokehold. I mean, come on. He shouldn't have been in a chokehold. When you do something like that, now you start to regain public trust. Now the public starts to see you for something other than us against them. And if we're going to bridge that gap, that us against them gap, that's what needs to happen. Because if we continue with this blue shield, the way it is intact, it's always going to be us against them. Because cops make mistakes. Cops do wrong things, just like the Chrysler worker in the plant does something wrong every now and then. Every industry sees somebody do something wrong. But protecting that in that way is what's causing this boy that's white.
I guess I'll start with a small story that might illustrate some of the culture that we've been speaking of in the police department. When I was a young cop, I'm going to say back in maybe 2006 or so, we had a call behind a series of buildings. They came in as a gun run, which means that someone's called the police and said, oh, they have a gun behind this building. So we go back there, and usually we would roll in heavy with the call like that because we don't know if it's actually a gun. Most of the time it's not, because people tend to call the police and report a gun run when they want kids scattered off the neighborhood or the corner or something like that. So we show up behind this series of buildings. So there's a group of kids back there, young African-American kids. And we had a description of one guy. We checked him out, we checked everyone out. There was no gun, at least no gun that we found. What they were doing was shooting a music video, which involved some noise. So it's my guess someone called the police and they wanted us to show up and chase them away. But there was nothing there. They were kids, they weren't really doing anything. But what happened afterwards stuck with me now. One of the cops, and again, I was a rookie at this point, so I didn't really know what was going on so much. But one of the cops, for some reason, he got very upset and started swearing at these kids, up and down, left and right, just very abusive language. And it was unnecessary, and it was uncalled for, and it shouldn't have happened. And I'm standing there listening to this, and I was embarrassed and ashamed that this guy who's in the same uniform as me is basically acting so poorly without cause. And I remember this young kid, 15 or so, he's standing there and he's listening, and he says, very dignified, "Officer, why are you speaking to me like that?" And he was absolutely right. It was totally uncalled for. And I looked to the sergeant, who was also there, did nothing. Did nothing. It was acceptable. And what Mr. Williams is saying is correct. There's a marked reluctance for officers to speak out against each other. That's a minor incident, what I just described. But of course, there are much more serious ones. In terms of Professor Barrett's question about reluctance to change, there's absolutely a reluctance. There's almost an animosity about outside interference. Like, for instance, Eric Garner. The situation with him, I have a lot of friends who are cops. I listen to what they said about this. They actively resent the idea that, oh, who are you to tell me how to do my job? You're not out there risking your life. And there's an us versus them mentality. Maybe rightly or wrongly in some situations, but it's absolutely there. So they'll take, some politician will say, this shouldn't happen, they won't listen. Some ex-cop will say this could have been handled differently, could have been done better. It's like, you don't know what you're talking about, even if you used to do it yourself. There were even news stories where active duty police officers, black police officers would say this was handled poorly, you're crazy. What do you mean? So if there's a tendency to ignore even constructive advice or criticism from inside the department itself, I almost despair of how that's actually going to change. I mean, I liked to a certain degree what the mayor said. I think he addressed the reality in terms of people living in the city. I did not find it offensive or the stab in the back that so many officers seem to find it to be. I don't really understand that. But if the mayor, who is technically the head of the police department, himself cannot affect change, I don't know how to get it done.
I think the community policing issue is the big issue because it establishes relationships that are deep in the community. It prevents crime. It allows people to get to know the police officers for who they are, that they're human beings, they have families to go home to. And I think if we're talking about leadership and how they can affect change, I think that's one way to immediately start the process. By getting police officers to get them out of their police cars, get them out of the cruisers, and onto the streets. And if they do that, over time we will see a decrease in crime and an increase in the enhanced relationships between law enforcement and the community, at least in those communities that do.
I'm going to take this moment, I don't know if Jean has something quick, but I wanted to open it up to the rest of you in the audience. And we're going to have students perhaps help, or Professor Costello will just share this microphone to go around. And so even those of you in the back bench, feel free to participate. That's the first time.
To address what you were saying, Mr. Williams, about the, I'm sure I can echo. I'll project my voice a little louder. Regarding the presence, the increased presence of the police officers in the communities, yes, I agree with you. Over time, it definitely would establish a trust relationship. Of course, familiarity would do that naturally. There's been, and you're right, it's culturally, there's been, particularly in music or even in any sort of mindset of the community, think about gangs in the community and the power that they have with weapons. And maybe this is, of course, in your time, one of my time, the power and the influence that they have over young kids as far as the threat that they can project or even the security that you can have for joining them. Well, now you're essentially inserting another gang into the community. And that's the way a lot of us see thugs, essentially. And it's not police officers, it's thugs. But when someone acts in a way where they're using power to threaten or to make you move in such a way, I've never once called a police officer a help. You can imagine, it's surprising to watch across the street, not those officers get arrested. I've been arrested several times. But this is more of a southern mentality as well. Texas particularly. It's just, it is a divide. And it's unfortunate that I sound so angry when I speak. It's unfortunate that it's affecting me in such a way. I think to answer the question, a very immediate response would be if you want to change the system, become the system, which is where you see us, and I definitely want to join you guys over there in your coalition. I think the more, during the march, for example, during the march, Black Lives Matter, all the police officers that were there, you could see it in their faces how tense in any moment it could have exploded. The only ones that interacted with us in any sort of dialogue, besides threatening dialogue, was the African American officers. And it was, like you mentioned, a shame reaction. It was a, sorry that you have to do this. I'm glad that you're doing this. We're really good at protecting. Yes, we came here with a noble gesture. We really want to affect change in our communities. Well, like you said, cynicism sets in. All the people I was marching next to were projecting hate towards police officers. I wasn't with that. They were the ones saying that if you take our lives, we're going to take yours. Lo and behold, a couple of weeks later, it happened. They were saying it was going to happen. I think, and it's unfortunate, I'm sorry to bring that up, I think that more of us here are in a position to help now that we're here. And under leadership like yours, you're going to I'm surprised I'm still here. I'm surprised I'm still alive. Your book, I read it, most, definitely read as much as I could of it. It has a great point. Naturally, we're communicators, we're orators here, that's our job. We're able to speak to police officers, not a lot of people who do that. I know, I do that.
So that speaks to the three-pronged approach I mentioned, selection, education, and then community policing. Well, you have to select and educate the right people to community police. You can't just throw people into a place that won't accept them and expect that they're going to be able to communicate and build relationships in a proper way. You have to select the right people, number one. Educate them. And then allow them to do that job. So I understand your point. That's the result of perhaps the wrong people community policing. So it defeats the purpose of the whole thing if you have the wrong people doing it. And I just want to bring up a point. So the 15-year-old who was cussed out by the officer, what does that 15-year-old, who does that 15-year-old grow up to be? That 15-year-old grows up to be somebody who at least, at the very least, has that memory of how he or she was treated on that day. Probably could, with clarity, talk about that day. To this day, and that person's probably an adult by now. So what are we doing by not doing this? I mean, we have no other way to go. We have to do something that's going to change this system. I'm a little bit more optimistic. I think that if somebody has the courage to sit down with the union leader and say, listen, this is what we need to do. It's not working. Let's figure this out. And they implement those 3 easy steps on paper, at least. We'll have a different generation of adults at some point. And that different generation of adults won't hate the police. And not hating the police means that the police might actually not hate them. So I was stopped numerous times when I was a kid. I was that 15-year-old kid on many occasions. Height of the crack epidemic in the 80s, when everybody on my block was selling. And I was the only one who wasn't, but they thought I was. So I was constantly being stopped. And what did I grow up to be? The exact opposite, because I had great people around me who were able to nurture that hate out of me. But that doesn't happen a lot. Most of the time, the hate festers.
Quick question over here.
Hi, my name is Alicia Torres. I'm a career guide. So in your book, you say you have 2 major goals: avoid confrontation and retain your freedom. And then you say you can make the officer accountable later. What can people do to make the officer accountable? What do you think the steps the community should take towards these officers who, are continuing to do that? You say you lead the officer and you're usually smiling, but do you think that stops them from stopping the next young black man who they feel is just young black and driving? What are the things that we can do to move forward?
My approach isn't changing the officer in whole, but I'm nipping away at that officer bit by bit. Because when he approaches me, if he or she has one way of thinking, and listen, officers for the most part are great. They're serving and protecting, giving their lives. They have homes with kids in them, wives, families. But if an officer approaches me thinking one thing that is incorrect, they'll leave me thinking something else. So when they approach the next guy who looks like me, they'll think twice about treating that person that way. And over time, if that happens a lot, it's nipped away at their predisposition just a bit. Maybe that nipping away saves a life. Maybe it keeps somebody out of jail. I don't know. But I know it does nip away a bit at what they thought.
Hi. My name is Alicia Parker. I retired 20 years ago from the New York City Police Department after 23 years, and I retired as a Lieutenant Detective Commander, and he was a friend of mine, invited me today.
Yes.
I don't know if this is a multi-pronged problem. It's not just one issue. It's not just the police department. It's also the community. Both areas have to work on, have things that they have to work on. And I don't know if anybody's been listening to Police Commissioner Bratton and the things that he has been saying recently, where he said that the relationship between the black community and law enforcement started with the slave catchers. And that's how our relationship has evolved. And through Jim Crow and how law enforcement enforced the Jim Crow laws, all those kinds of things have fed into how the black community feels about law enforcement. So I'm encouraged by what Commissioner Bratton is saying and what he's doing. He convened a meeting with the Guardian Association, which is the Black Police Officers Association, to ask them what can I do? What are some of the things I can do? And he got a lot of good ideas, So I'm encouraged by what he's doing right now. And it's going to take a long time. It's a process. It's going to take a long period of time. But by working together, community, organizations, police, and when we talk about there's only 1 or 2% that's doing wrong in law enforcement, 90% of people, as you said, 90% of law enforcement people feel that they did no wrong. They feel that way. They feel that Eric Garner caused his death. So we're not looking at people that are just standing back and saying, oh, the officer did wrong, and they feel that Eric Garner caused his death. So we have to also understand the perspective that we're dealing with here. And we cannot necessarily change what's going on in somebody in a law enforcement officer's head, but we can certainly change their behavior. And that's what we're looking to do. Like you said, people grow up in a certain way, they're going to do certain things, but we certainly can change behavior if we keep on this.
And just so you know, Alicia, she left as one of the highest ranking females in the NYPD, but then she went on to become Director of Security for the NBA and ESPN, so a legend for sure. She knows what she's talking about. And she's a nice person.
Just briefly, there's two things I'd like to just comment about the NYPD more specifically, and things that I would like to see changed. And hopefully, part of my hope here is that as future leaders and lawyers, we might actually be able to affect it. If I could change two things, Mr. Williams spoke about economics. First off, there's an enormous play of economics in policing today. I'm going to speak just to the NYPD, whereby each officer is expected largely to write a certain number of tickets each month and arrest a certain number of people. And there's a lot of reasons for that. We can talk about CompStat, for instance, but a lot of it comes down to money. So long as sort of they're looking for policing and summonses to kind of bolster their budget on the city's level, this is going to continue to be a problem. So it sort of leads to situations where officers are writing tickets or arresting people, not necessarily because they have to, but because they're pushed to. So you need to, I would suggest everyone needs to be aware of that. And secondly, there's a sort of a mindset that's also developed in recent years where a lot of cops that I have seen and know, they think that they're soldiers. Particularly after 9/11, they got this idea that they were troops. And there's a massive difference between the mindset of a police officer and the mindset of a soldier. We could talk about that for hours, but basically, soldiers have an enemy. Soldiers kill people. The way a police officer is supposed to be doing it is entirely different. One problem may be that a lot of the U.S. Army or different military organizations, they've been selling their surplus goods to police departments all across the country. You're kidding. And if you're a police department somewhere and you've got a tank or all this SWAT gear, it's not just going to gather dust. They're going to use it. So these guys come out there with the mindset that, I got the enemy out there, in Brooklyn, in Queens, I got to go, they think they're in Fallujah. So that's another thing to be aware of. These guys some of them, we call them buffs. They're hyper aggressive and can be dangerous. Well, I guess that's it for now.
And the stat issue is something that I was introduced to. Statistics was something I was introduced to when I stepped foot into the FBI office. You had to, at the end of every month, catalog what your stats are. Arrests, convictions, under your informants, your CWs, your cooperating witnesses. You had to catalog this. So you were encouraged to find arrests. This is the FBI. I was stunned by that. I thought you just came in and you did, if there's crime, you find it, and you fight it. But you're actually encouraged to do it. That's an issue. And that's a system, a systemic issue.
Hi, my question is about, I grew up in communities like your maternal grandparents, mostly white, predominantly Jewish, where people really don't have the experience with the police. And if they do have experience with the police, it's usually positive. And I was just wondering, what can we do to fight ignorance? What can we do to educate people who don't have that experience that this is a legitimate problem and it's not something that's being caused by their skin color, because so many people are just so ignorant and say, well, black people commit more crime, so this is what's going to happen. How do we educate people to be less ignorant on the subject?
I'm going to pass this to the professors as well, but they probably know just more than me on this. But seriously, the exposure is important. I mean, it all comes down to exposure. Those kids in that pool, that's where they lived in their little cocoon. They never saw a black kid until I came into the picture. So TV told them what I was. Magazines told them what I was, cartoons. And until they were exposed to it, they didn't understand that we had a lot of overlapping similarities. We had some differences, but let's embrace those differences. And they learned to do that over time. Well, the law enforcement community is the same way, the corporate community is the same way. I mean, what we're seeing in Ferguson with only 3 black cops in a town with 67% of the community being black, just to use a simple word, that's ridiculous. To have that in existence. So how do we change this? We give people exposure to differences, to different people. Let them work on the job. Let them go knock down some doors with people who don't look like them. Let them bond with people who don't look like them. There was a time when women were absolutely never going to be on a SWAT team. There was a time when women wouldn't be on a police force. And then when women started to knock down doors, literally knocking down doors with their fellow police officers said, hey, she's pretty good. I like her. Let's give another one a chance. And another one, and another one, and another one. And that's the way it happens, exposure. But in those little towns, like the town where my grandmother lived, there were none. They didn't let them in. They didn't let them in. And that's why the cycle would just continue. I was stopped in the book I talk about when I was stopped in front of that house because my college roommate, who happened to be black, got a little bit lost, made one wrong turn, and then found my house. He was lost for maybe 16 seconds, and somebody called the cops. And the cops pulled up just behind him, and I was outside to greet him, and they didn't believe I lived there. They couldn't believe I lived there until my white mother came out and said, what's going on? And they said, who are you? She said, I'm his mother. And red-faced, they get in their car and leave. But no exposure. That's the whole issue.
If I could piggyback on that, I live in a similar town, and not only is my town fairly monolithic in terms of race and wealth and class, it also, politically is actually quite liberal, a town. And what I am constantly astounded by is not just their ignorance with respect to being in someone else's shoes, but also their own ignorance about their own selves and their own communities. And so, after prosecuting endless amounts of intimate violence cases in Manhattan for about 5 years, I eventually found myself in this little town. And they had an article in the local paper that basically was an article of shock and dismay about the fact that there had been a recent incident, an arrest of domestic violence. In local papers, they still have these little police blotters. And you guys are old kids, you'll read it too. And most of it's about cats and trees. But every once in a while, there's an arrest for intimate violence. And that didn't surprise me at all. I had more than learned that intimate violence is everywhere and it has nothing to do with color and class. But they had no understanding of that. And what was in the paper was basically how victims of intimate violence and abuse had started to put yellow ribbons around light poles on Main Street in Little Town. And that every day there were more and more of these yellow ribbons in their community. Similar thing with drug use and drug abuse, illegal narcotics. At the Little League game, I found myself talking to a pain management physician in my little town. And pain management physicians are heavily regulated and supervised by law enforcement. And one of the things they have to do is they have to test everyone who comes into their office for drug use on every single visit. The first thing you do is pee in a cup. And he said, you would be shocked, like 95% of the people who come in, our neighbors test positive for some kind of unlawful drug, but often marijuana, often other things too, in our little town. And so what's just so upsetting is the fact that there's ignorance, not just about others, but ignorance also about what is true in their own communities, to everyone's detriment. And I want to offer them, and I'm going to turn it to you, how do we get at that? At least one of the things I think about in being affiliated with an educational institution is that this is exposure. This dialogue is perhaps late in life, in the 20s, but this is a part of that. And it needs to happen more frequently, it needs to happen earlier. But this is a part of the value of diversity in educational institutions. And so I hope we're achieving some of that tonight.
Yeah, I'll just echo what Q and Elaine said. That it's a great question. And Quentin had the answer, exposure. Dialogue, getting to know, really know, or in Bishop Bratton's phrase, really see people who are different from you. I'll use a non-race example just to illustrate this. To someone like me who's 50 and kind of keen socialism, the way in which social views on same-sex marriage have changed in the last 10 years is astonishing how quickly it's happened. And I think the reason it's happened is really simple, and that's exposure. I didn't have a gay acquaintance until I was in law school. I didn't have a gay friend until several. Well, yeah. Well, yeah. That's why I used the word acquaintance. I was going to say I didn't know a gay person, and obviously I knew lots of gay people. I just didn't know them. And as other cultural changes led to more and more gay people coming out of the closet, and coming out of the closet sooner, and coming out of the closet more visibly, the multiplication effect about everybody realizing they knew and loved people who were homosexual just changed social views that if you get 10, 15 years ago seemed completely entrenched really quickly. Race is different and in some ways more complicated for two reasons. Unlike sexual orientation, race is visible. And so it becomes a way in which people, in a deep subconscious, implicit sense, deal with the world. And that's not necessarily bad, but when you think about, as soon as you encounter someone, probably the first thing you notice about them is their gender. And the second thing may be their race or age. Right? And what your brain is doing is just processing them. You know, trying to figure who they are, put them in place in your brain. And so race becomes this a way in which we process things. And that creates a risk that it becomes a proxy for a lot of other things. And another challenge with race is the deep ways in which segregation, for lack of better words, still affects American society. So most of us grow up in neighborhoods that are not truly integrated. And that reduces the opportunities to really know someone who is different from you and has a different experience. So the positive spin on this, though, is what do you do? Exactly what we're doing here. Exactly what the Coalition for Social Justice is doing. Forming a mechanism to bring people together for dialogue and for getting to know each other better. And then, who knows what that's going to lead to, but it's going to lead to something good. And Ian and Leah went, I'm already following you on Twitter, but sign me up. And the second thing about exposure is you're not just a group of well-educated people getting together to talk. You're future lawyers. Your future prosecutors, your future defense attorneys, your future civil rights litigators, your future mayors and judges and police commissioners. And seize that opportunity, both to bring your perspective as a gift to the power that lawyers can have, and also to use the opportunity to broaden your horizons, deepen your knowledge, and increase your exposure through your work as a lawyer.
I just want to add to all of that, to continue to sort of fight it up at the policy level, not just in the educational environment and the activists and your own career, but there's an agenda, a really big, unfinished national agenda. You can kind of look at various points where we were, kind of on it and making progress, and obviously the Selma anniversary is a moment to focus on voting rights and activism with regard to that. But in lots of ways, we need to push the world to meet the other. Because when that happens, even fitfully, even in small ways, there will start to be a new data set. And people will start to sort of see the world, and things will remind them of things that are now familiar, even if it's only a slight experience. Eric Garner, not immediately dead on the sidewalk, but actually struggling on the sidewalk, is, just another African-American guy to somebody who doesn't know many African-Americans. It's different when somebody's got a black friend or a black colleague or a black loved one or a black family member, and, change the race of the ethnicity. This isn't just a black-white thing. So pushing for the less segregated world, the more integrated world, the more connected world, gives people more useful data that makes them forces for good or for better on this issue. And I think that's kind of the career path that we're all on. We'll all do 100 million things as lawyers, and a lot of it will just be technical craftsmanship. But we're going to be in places, and we're going to have power, and we're going to have voices where we can contribute to policy too. And I think that's sort of maybe the top layer in this pyramid, but it's connected to everything else.
I just want to add one thing to that quickly. So the book was written as a way to get people home. Just taking that little piece out of this whole thing. Let's get people home, and then we can battle. Once we get home, and we can talk about this bigger picture. We need to talk about this bigger picture. The dialogue we're having is extremely important. It's a beginning. But it's nothing without creatively strategizing to do something. And that's my little creative strategy. So what's your little creative strategy? What's it going to be? I did that at home. I did that by myself, or my wife, of course, feeding me information, but That's what that was. And everybody in this room has that creative bit that they can add to this. And in aggregate, that means an awful lot. So think about it in those terms, because we can talk. I had somebody say to me who's fed up, a civil rights marcher. She was with Martin, and she said, "I've had enough talking. I want action." So we need both. I implore you to figure out creatively what you can do, and these groups are doing just that. But individually, you can do something too. Find what it is.
I wanted to mention part of the problem.
Not you, John.
No. We have one behind you.
It feels a little awkward asking a question after the call to action. You mentioned economics in the beginning, and then it just wasn't really brought out here. Before I ask a question, I just wanted to hear you speak more about that issue and how deeply that affects, the community and what we're dealing with.
Well, I have some people that you probably be able to speak to it really well, but I have some people, I'm just going from experience, who say it's all economics. And when I look back on my childhood and I look at what happened to the kids on my block and why they decided to do what they were doing, made bad decisions, not that they should have made those decisions. They made economic decisions. I look at the prison system, and on many levels, it's economic. Economics are coming into play. The reason for private prisons being a business now, they're building more prisons because it's a great business. Well, you have to fill those prisons, and who do they fill them with? They fill them with people who don't have the means to fight getting in there. Don't have the ability to stay out. And this really hit home when I was with the FBI, because we were brought on prison visits when I was a candidate in Quantico. And it hit me so hard when I went to my first one. And I saw the faces. And I looked around and said, why is everybody black? What's the reason? So economics, and they were poor. They were from poor black upbringings, and they were in prison. And of course, it's very deep, and I'm sure John can speak to it. But yeah, economics plays a role. And if you look at leadership, leadership is allowing prisons to be built year after year after year, and we have to fill those prisons in order for them to be worth the build. The tens of millions that they're putting into each one. It's fairly simple in that way.
What steps would we be taking to correct these issues?
Well, it's obviously not an easy an easy fix. It's something that has to happen over time, and it's something that has to happen culturally. There has to be a shift. When I moved to the South, I was shocked that the next generation of people were mingling with each other more than I perceived they would be. Because I'd heard about the South. I'm a New Yorker. I heard about the South. This is very segregated. And then I go to Jacksonville, Florida, Charleston, South Carolina, and Charlotte, North Carolina. And I see these kids, teenagers, dating each other on the street. What are you doing? You're walking on the street with each other. Isn't that something that your parents could be mad about? Is it illegal? I don't even know. I mean, I'm a New Yorker, and I've heard stories, and they're urban myths in some regard. I know it's not illegal, but I'm thinking somebody out here is not going to like that. What are you doing? Why are you doing it so comfortably? And I continue to look around, and it wasn't an anomaly. This is what was happening. The next generation, they were being exposed to other people and differences. And that is the change, right? That's the change.
Ben, I'll offer this for you to think about in terms of economics and then what you can do. So the connection between crime and poverty is sort of obvious. And the connection between poverty and race in American society is obvious. So it sometimes feels inevitable we're going to have a connection between race and crime. So even if you assume, and it's an unrealistic assumption, but even if you assume a system that is completely non-discriminatory, the criminal justice system is going to have a much more adverse impact on poor people and therefore on people of color. So how do you solve that problem? Well, solve the poverty problem, right? And that sounds like a flip answer, but that's so obviously hard and so multifaceted that it can seem overwhelming. But if you think about maybe a simpler political policy approach, and that is something that I think is gathering more steam, and that is thinking about crime under the mantra of smart on crime and not tough on crime. Those kinds of political shifts are race neutral, but are going to have a hugely beneficial effect on minority communities if our approach to crime fighting and our approach to prosecution, our approach to imprisonment is more about smart ways to reduce crime, make communities safer, and less about locking and warehousing large groups of people. That's going to have a very beneficial impact on minority communities without having to solve the entire poverty problem in the United States.
I have one more thing, I'm sorry, but I want to say, when you talk about things to deal with, you talked about the prison population. Well, I think there's something that may have, that's coming up that may have a direct impact on the prison population. The law enforcement, particularly the police department, has a bill pending in the state legislature to raise resisting arrest from a misdemeanor to a felony. That's going to affect millions of people, all right? And as we know, if you're stopped and you think you're stopped illegally, you may not go, calmly. You may not do that. So I think if there's something that you want to do and you disagree with that policy, you may want to think about lobbying for that. And you may want to think about going to your state senator and letting them know how you feel about that. And maybe even going up to testify. I don't know when the hearings are, but you may want to go up to testify.
I think we'll take a couple more comments.
Yes, right here. He's one of my classmates. he gets
Is this stage?
deference to Rita.
Could you excuse my eyes to get it lost?
I did.
But it's an observation. I'm a Muslim American, and I've been arrested as well. I've had violent altercations, for instance, with law enforcement. But I'm an attorney that works with the process. And I've noticed that whenever anything bad happens, whether it's a terrorist attack or whether it's an incident with regards to an unarmed African-American male being killed, or if it's let's call it a very attractively dressed co-ed in a school that gets raped. There's a tendency in this country, and it's led by the media, and they're trying to watch it, to go to the extremes. Everyone kind of says, I have to identify with one or the other extreme. And I learned a long time ago, whenever there's deep madness, I learned to live. Because, when 9/11 happened, there was a tendency that it was, all Muslims. Well, no one knew it. No one believed that. There was something that wanted to portray that, and then you had certain segments of the Muslim population all of a sudden being viewed and then thinking that they were the extreme, which is not true. And I think that I talk about race all the time. I consider myself an American. I'm also, a man of color. I'm also a Republican. Go figure, right? And I don't apologize for any of those things, okay? But I think it's important to your point, you're saying, what do you do with it? My first volunteer to police was I at a party at Boston College. You might have been in college at that time. We graduated at the same time. And there was one of these illegal house parties that you probably never heard of, but we used to have. And there were like 150 of us all partying stuff, and the police came to break it up. And there was like 140, regular white kids and a bunch of us. And my friend and I, his name was Christian, we were all being dispersed, and we were walking away, and this officer came up and kind of pushed us. He goes, listen, he said, I know your people don't like police officers. And Christian was at Harvard in full scholarship. I turned around and I said, what the F did you just say to me? And they were like, stop. And the point was that it was for no reason he was picked out. Now, he ended up becoming an attorney as well, as did I. Rather than take an extreme position, the system is easy to fix, but we have to want to do it. The tendency is to kind of look and well, the cops are bad. Cops can't be bad, okay? Black people are bad. Blacks can't be bad. Gay people are weird. They're not weird. And the more we talk about it, I think that the fact you're here, and you're here, and I'm here, is huge. And I know that one of the reasons you wrote this book is because you were blessed with a son a few years ago.
Yes.
And what you're doing and what we're doing is exactly what needs to get done. And it happens incrementally, but it will happen.
One thing I just want to say is, he's absolutely right about the extremes. And there's a tendency to migrate to the extremes. There's an example in the press recently of a celebrity doing something that she wasn't necessarily proud of. Taraji P. Henson's son was approached by the cops, and she took his side, of course her son's side, and railed against the police. And then found out that the officer who approached her son was actually it was a great stop. The guy did everything he could to help out her son. I mean, the epitome of what a police officer should be. And she had to apologize. And that's a lesson to her, but it's a lesson to the world that let's get the facts first. Let's understand what they are, and then let's make a decision. Because when we're mad and emotional, we can sometimes go to those extremes. And so, Taraji is an example. I'm an example with what has happened to me of keeping emotion as much as you can, keeping it out of it. It's just extremely emotional issue for good reason. But if you are emotional about this, you might end up on one of those extremes, and that's not a good place to be. It's not a good place to be if you're a cop who's an extreme person, if you're a person in the public who's an extreme person. You need to be balanced when you approach these things.
Okay, you have the last.
So earlier we talked about, when you have negative interactions with police officers, or when you walk away from that situation with anger or with the feeling that maybe you were targeted for less than honorable means. You said that the reason why you didn't let that anger didn't fester was because you kind of had it nurtured out of you. And even, just now, my question, I guess, would be, like, what would be the best way to kind of combat that anger or that resentment? Because, like, for me, I have an 18-year-old brother who's already had a situation with police officers where he felt like he was, racially profiled and wrongly targeted. And for me, who's never had a negative interaction with police officers, it's kind of hard for me. Like, he feels like, I don't understand, I don't get it. So it's hard for me to kind of keep him from those extremes and try to explain to him, all police officers aren't like that. So what's the best ways that if you are encountering that situation again, you don't end up on that extreme and end up reacting badly because you feel like it's a pattern or because you're tired of it happening?
I tell people that with every approach, improper approach, I've had dozens of them over my life. With every one of them, a piece of me, a piece of my soul was taken. And I had to find a way to get that back. And so what I did, because I didn't have a big sister who could help me out, what I did was I surrounded myself with people who could help me through that. And I also, some of those people were cops. I got to learn about who they were, what they're up against. I got to learn about their families and that they're human. And I got to learn that not all cops were doing what was done to me. And that helped out a lot. I had the good fortune of becoming one. So I then was surrounded by many more of them. And I can tell you that the vast majority of them will put their life on the line to save somebody who doesn't look like them. But there are, one thing I learned is that there are extremes. There are extreme cops. And those extreme cops give the other ones a bad name, which is why I'm so against the blue shield. I wish the people who are part of the vast majority would stand up against the extremes. And perhaps leadership at some point will figure out a way to make that happen by dialogue and creating relationships with the unions that they need to create. So to answer your question, you're the way into your brother's heart. You're the one.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a real rewarding and exceptional evening. I hope that all of us got something for our soul, for our hearts, for our minds from it, and just from the exchange. Quentin, this has been really special, and I hope we get many more repeat appearances. I can't wait for part 2. Maybe there's some co-authors right here in the audience. And I want us to just all thank our roundtable participants too, in particular our to end. I know those of us on the faculty, in particular here, the 3 of us spoke. We do have, I think, many different ideas about what students and what the coalition can do in terms of action steps from big to small. And so it would be great if you guys wanted to join